Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Writer's Edge. I'm your host, Christie Stratos, and tonight we are talking science fiction versus fantasy and how they compare to each other. So make sure you stick around to the end because we also have an announcement to make about The Writer's Edge going forward. And these are all good things that you guys are going to really like what I announce with Mickey. Even though we have set topics, as always, leave your questions in the chat and I will do my best to get them answered. And if we don't have time, then I'll just leave them in the comments section below afterwards for our panelists to answer. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so that you can know when we go live or when we post a new video. So first, I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then I will also introduce myself. So why don't we start with Tony?
Oh, we're going age before beauty, I see. My name is, my name's Tony Phillips. I live and work in San Diego. I'm the author of 3 books currently. I've done nonfiction work. I've written for a number of publications over the years. My first science fiction novel has been out for about a year now, and it's a work of dystopian science fiction in the near future. So this is going to be as informative to me as I can be informative to anyone else.
That's great. I always learn things during these too, and I'm the one hosting them.
Yeah.
Okay, so how about you, Kelsey?
Hi, I'm Kelsey Barthel. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm the author of Beyond the Code. It's a first in a urban fantasy adventure with people with extraordinary abilities in a secret underbelly society. It just came out on January 30th. It is my first novel, so I'm brand new to a lot of this. Thank you.
It's great.
So I'm hoping to learn a lot here.
Yeah, we all will. And you next, Jackie?
Hi, I'm Jackie. My name's Jackie Carr. I'm an author living in Las Vegas. If I had to classify myself, I would currently say I'm a sci-fi fantasy YA author, even though I don't like the super genre, and I probably will not super genre in upcoming projects. That's what I have now. My second book, actually my third. My mainstream series, MARTYR, short story patterns and reeling, and I just released MARTYR Substance, book of the original, which should be out later tonight or tomorrow morning. It's a publication uploaded on Amazon. So.
Great.
There we go.
Yeah, great to have you here. I already saw you on Spilling Ink, so I'm excited that you'll be here as well. And how about you, Richard?
I'm Richard Paolinelli. I just recently moved to Omaha, Nebraska from California, and so it's a little chaotic around here, but we're getting there. I have written in science fiction, fantasy, mystery thrillers, and sports nonfiction. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything. Recently, I took on the role as the managing editor for a website called urban-fantasy.com. We deal with stories of urban legends. So we're getting that up and running, and we're running into, I think our greatest debate is whether or not Harry Potter qualifies as urban fantasy. So it's going to get interesting before it gets all said and done. But I've been writing fiction now for about 3 years, and I would tell you the list of what I've written, but we'd be here another hour doing that. So I'll spare everybody. I'll tell you later where to find them all.
Okay, thanks a lot, Richard. And you guys know me, I am Christie Stratos. I'm the author of the Dark Victoriana collection, which includes the books Anatomy of a Darkened Heart and Lock and Key, which I will have news about relatively soon. I am also on Wattpad, and I have a couple of free short stories there, both under 1,000 words, so you can always check me out there. Okay, let's get right into it. So I'm going to start out with one that has to do with the difference between science fiction and fantasy. It seems pretty obvious, but at the same time, we see that science fiction and fantasy are often lumped together, like in genre statistics, on Amazon, their categories. A lot of times it's science fiction and fantasy, and then you see the rest of the category. I saw that on this site, sfsite.com. It says that Isaac Asimov was once asked to explain the difference between science fiction and fantasy, which is interesting that he was even asked to. Obviously, people aren't sure sometimes. And he said that science fiction, given its grounding in science, is possible. Fantasy, which has no grounding in reality, is not. So it seems like a pretty stark difference, and yet we see that these things are lumped together, these two genres. So why do you all think that they're so often closely linked together, when they're actually so clearly different. And you guys can just speak at will.
I think the main problem with science fiction, with people miscategorizing the genre, is because a lot of people think if it's in the future or if it's in space, then it's automatically a science fiction, which is not always the case. There's like a good example of this is Star Wars. Is it a fantasy or science fiction? But you could say that the idea of the Force and the whole Jedi Order makes it more of a fantasy than a science fiction, because they basically use a kind of magic. Yeah, so and that's an ongoing debate whether Star Wars is a fantasy or a science fiction.
Well, I think the other thing that's causing the two to kind of mesh is that what used to be considered fantasy is now kind of considered science. You know, you don't have to go that far back in time to where, you know, somebody grabbing a cell phone and having that little flashlight app and having this beam of light come out. You know, if you did that 100 years ago, people would think you're a wizard of some sort. So I think that's kind of driving this blending of the two, because, you know, as we advance in science, a lot of what used to be fantasy is now science fact.
Yeah, they say that magic is just science we don't understand.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder too, though, if Asimov wasn't a little too broad with saying that science fiction is possible. I mean, I wonder if it's not better to say it's plausible. You know, it's interesting to think about the things that sci-fi has gotten wrong. If you watch Star Trek and they're talking on walkie-talkies, nobody anticipated the proliferation of telecommunication technology. There was no way to see that we wouldn't be talking to one mainframe computer, huge installation, but instead we would have trillions of small pieces all interconnected. Right. And, you know, so sometimes maybe sci-fi gets it wrong, but it's grounded in what is at least plausible. And what do we do with the work of, and in the late 70s, I read Clan of the Cave Bear. Well, that's the reverse of science fiction. It's set in the Neolithic time, right? And yet, that author anticipated what we would come to know as fact, which is that early modern humans and Neanderthals did in fact blend, though at the time, mainstream anthropology considered it heresy. You know, is that science fiction? It takes a look at science and what's at least plausible, although at the time it was discounted.
Yeah, it's a lot like what happened to Jules Verne. A lot of what he wrote, people were like, oh, you're crazy, that'll never happen. You know, and look at all the things he wrote about that we're doing now.
Well, I think just from a book standpoint, like when I think science fiction, first of all, everybody's points I think were valid, and I think they all kind of contribute to why the genres are being blended. But when I think from a book standpoint, I think of, I can't remember the author, but the gentleman who wrote The Martian. That,
Andy Weir?
Yes,
yeah.
That would be a hard definition of a science fiction novel. You know, science fiction based on reality and something tangible that we do know and understand. Now, when you talk about fantasy, that's something you can kind of comprehend, and there's meaning behind. There's an explanation behind why things happen in a scientific standpoint. Now, when you talk about like Dracula and stuff like that, no one ever asks why, or wizards. No one ever asks how or why they can actually do magic. You know what I'm saying? There's no basis on why. It's just Dracula can turn into a bat, and that's what he can do. There's no explanation for it. You know, so I believe those are the two extremes. And then when I believe the melding of a genre, because that's what I like to do, I actually do that. So it's kind of a pseudoscience in my, you know, it's loosely based on facts. It's not just Dracula can do this because he's Dracula. I'm giving some kind of rationale for being able to do that. Whether it is, you know, from my standpoint, it's loosely based on actual science. And I think that's how I melt them, and that's why they come together for me, because I just don't like to explain things in that sense. Like, you know, wizards can have magic because they're magical. You know, just from a book standpoint, I think that's where they're dwelling at this point.
But you know, Jackie, you said something interesting in your introduction, which is, you know, you cross genres. You can enter 1, 2, or 3, or you can decide to eschew titles or genres altogether, and you know, part of the answer why sci-fi and fantasy seem to be linked together is because the book industry needs to categorize, right? And I find it a little bit derisive, actually, that there's literary fiction, which is the only thing taken to be serious and authorial and written with an eye for the art of the word, and then all the rest of it is genre fiction, as though it's somehow pulpy or what have you. Why can't a thing be what it is without that label?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Those are all really great points. And as Antonio Lopez is saying in the chat, he says, as an example, Mary Shelley, her work was once considered fantasy at first, and then it became and was recognized as sci-fi. Yeah, it also, I guess, depends on when, I mean, we're alive in this time period when there's a lot more genre mixing and definitions and all that kind of stuff. Even for fantasy, there are something like 50-something or 60-something subgenres in fantasy, you know, and they mix sci-fi. So these are really great points, really great points.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that there are any hard and fast rules that you have that have to be followed for your genre? And are there any of those that you decided to break on purpose?
Well, I don't know if it's a hard and fast rule. I just noticed that in urban fantasy, it's something that's always done, where they always have fantasy elements in our world specifically, like on Earth in a city like Chicago or New York or something. But where I took away from that, because I wanted to do the urban fantasy genre, but I wanted to create my own world. So I just ended up creating a world kind of like this, but with different cultures and different world building aspects. That's the way that I kind of subverted from it, where a lot of other urban fantasy is basically take magic or vampires or werewolves and just add them into the modern world.
Yeah, that seems to be the typical description we're coming across as we're building this site. But I like your point of it doesn't have to be on Earth to be urban fantasy, as long as it's a setting in a major city or a fairly good sized town. I don't care what planet it's on, as long as it is got that setting and it has the fantasy elements to it. I think it's definitely urban fantasy, and I don't see why there has to be a hard and fast, you know, it's got to be on Earth, because why, you know,
Right.
Why limit yourself that way?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because in my book MARTYR, it doesn't take place on Earth at all. I don't even name the planet, just on purpose, because I want people just to be enthralled with the discovery of it. I don't want them to say, well, that couldn't happen because this isn't Earth. And I don't want them to think that. So I kind of left that blank on purpose. I kind of want imagination to do that. I think when you, like you just said, when you ground something, you already putting it in a box. You know what I'm saying? Like, you kind of want it to be free and just atmospheric and just, you know, let the plot unfold and the characters develop, and that's what they focus on. Not, well, this is set in New York City and New Yorkers don't talk that way. You know what I mean? Like, I just
exactly.
That's brilliant.
I wonder too if for both what we would call sci-fi and fantasy, if essentially there has to be one key aspect of plot and theme that differs from reality. That there's something fundamental about it that is not actual truth right now today. Whether it's futuristic, whether it's historical, whether it's off-world, on-world, whether it's fantasy musing, or whether it's grounded in actual possible science in the future. That we have to have some fundamental element of the storyline that differs from our perceived reality. And that to me is what gives it the escapist quality that makes it either or sci-fi or fantasy, and sometimes maybe both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a good point.
Yeah, I can say, as someone who writes historical fiction, it can get in the way a lot. You know, if you have to, when you're trying to get right all of the, it's, for example, what you said exactly about it being like in New York, Jackie. That's exactly why I don't name what state or town my stories take place in, because it's just, especially in Victorian times, you are limiting yourself so much when it comes down to that, and finding out what was available then, even what times, like if you want to have a character get mail, you got to be careful of exactly how many times a day they get mail, and did they even get it at that time, you know? So it can be very, very freeing to not have that restraint, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jim, Christina, and I teamed up to write a Western, and we had set it in a certain time frame. And we spent most of our time going and making sure that this town we're writing about actually existed at that time. And if not, then we had to go find another town. And you know, so your point about historical fiction, you are really handcuffing yourself, especially the further back you go, because you've got to make sure, because if you get one little thing wrong, you'll have somebody on you. They'll be like, oh, you got that wrong. That's not that. So your whole book is invalid. It's like, no, come on. But yeah, it's a challenge. And I do like, because I write some sci-fi fantasy and I mix them together, and I don't care what the rules are. They're out the window. I'm going to write the story this way. And it's really freeing to be able to do that and not have to sit there and go, oh, crap, is somebody going to call me because I didn't quite get that fact right, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
You know, the flip side, though, and it's interesting. My forthcoming novel is a historical Western set in West Texas, and written in the vernacular, as a matter of fact, in 1934. So we're talking about the lifetime of my parents. And while, yeah, I mean, it's horrible, the research that you have to do to get the vernacular right and make sure that the historical references are accurate and that model of Carr was actually available there and then. On the other hand, it's also quite a bit more grounding. It gives you some foundation in fact that, you know, you can't get it wrong, but on the other hand, you're less likely to get it wrong, because my current novel, The Fires of Orc, is based in 2032, and it incorporates the principles of quantum computing in the world. And I'm the first to confess, I'm not an expert in quantum computing or any kind of internet technology or information sharing. And it's scary that I could have just surmised this whole thing and gotten it wrong. I'm waiting for a techie person to say I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
Well, the worst mistakes are really when you have something that takes place in the 80s, but you've got things that are around today. You've got like iPhones and stuff like that. And if you have something in the 50s and you have too much technology, that's the stuff that people really get on you for. That can be painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mentioned before that Jackie was on Spilling Ink recently, and I did watch that episode. It was a great episode. So you can just type in Spilling Ink into YouTube and you'll find it. And they were talking about on there that audience attention span seems to be down in the way that they don't always want to, like, they don't always want or stay focused on loads of description. This is something I think I've noticed too, but Jackie, I was wondering if you could talk more about that, and I wanted to hear how everyone else felt too, especially since fantasy and sci-fi are so heavy in descriptions. We have to have a lot of world building and stuff.
Right. Well, throughout when I first started writing back in junior high school, when I stopped for years when I started partying and growing up and stuff. But when I recently got back into it back in 2014, and I finished my first novel, I started having conversations with people, and even people who were really interested in reading my book were telling me they were just having problems like reading stuff. Like, I'm the same way. Like, I love to write, but I don't necessarily like to read entire novels. Like, I'm jittery. Like, I can't focus. I can write, but I don't really necessarily like to read. So I took that into consideration when working on my next stuff. So I'm on purposefully like less descriptive, and I'm all about pacing. I think pacing is like key with today's like writing. Like, you have to keep it interesting through everything. It has to, like, every chapter has to be a button that you press and people are like, oh, I have to read this next chapter. The only book I ever read my whole life from front to back was S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. That's the only book I've ever read, and it never got around to nothing else. You know, that's what kind of inspired me to want to write. Yeah, but I just noticed that about people, and when they were telling this to me, I realized it must be true, because I am the same way, and I am a writer. You know, I have trouble sitting still and reading a book, and it loses me real quick. You know, I play a lot of video games. I'm one of those people, so I took that into consideration, and you know, I think that's something a lot of authors should look at instead of being over descriptive, like we mentioned Stephen King. I don't feel like you can write like him nowadays and sustain you know, today's audience. You know, what do you guys think about that? Because that wasn't something they touched on. I kind of just brought up the point they kind of overlooked.
Is that partly a question then of, I mean, who are you writing for? Obviously, I think the people who read Somerset Maugham or my own book, which it comes in at 120,000 words, I think that audience is dwindling, definitely. But there are still some word folks out there. I mean, there's still some some length addicts. I know that on the 24-hour news cycle, we can't pay attention long enough to what's being said for the 17th time. So we have to actually have a scroll across the bottom to tell us some other things that are going on simultaneously. That's a generational thing that, you know, I have to accept that there are people younger than me who, the majority of whom, don't pay attention because they don't have to. You know, it's just not required in a multimedia world. You can skip from interesting topic to interesting topic and not have to put up with the author's indulgence in this craft. I mean, that's so, but I still think that that's worth writing to. It's a small audience. You know, why do we do it? Do we do it to sell as many books as possible, or do we do it because it's true to who we are? And somewhere in between, I think, is kind of where I would like to fall. But I don't want to give up on the long descriptive craft altogether yet.
I think
please don't.
Go ahead, Kelsey. Go ahead.
Well, there's a difference between being like descriptive and being overly wordy. Like you still you can be very descriptive and eloquent, but you also have to be efficient in what you write. And that's one thing that I got told about when I was writing. Like one feedback that I got is especially with urban fantasy, because you can kind of just guess that people know what you're talking about when you specific terms. It's a little different for high fantasy, especially, but for just like urban fantasy and sci-fi, certain things people know what they're about. You don't need to spend a lot of time describing them because people know what it is. They're like, yeah, I know, move on.
I kind of like to write where I give you a little bit of a description of what I'm talking about, just enough so that the reader's imagination will fill in the blanks. And to me, it's a way to get them hooked into the story a little bit more, is to give them enough and force them to put the rest of it. And it's going to be a little bit different from what I might see, but at least they're into the story enough to where they're seeing it now. Maybe a little bit differently, but that's fine as long as they're reading. And I think the thing is, I don't think we're ever going to get back to where we have all the books are Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in length type of thing. I tried to write a book, the one that's coming out in September of mine is I wanted to be 110,000 words. I got to 60 something thousand and was done. And I was talking to my editor, and I'm thinking, I wanted to get to here, but how do I puff this up? She goes, you don't. You've told your story. It's done. And so it's hard to get out of that wanting to have the Tolkien sized book, but understanding the reader, the audience that I write for is probably not going to read it if it's that long. So you've got to shrink it down.
Yeah. There's a substantial difference too, Richard. I mean, part of the function of the book in 2018, I think even purists like me have to admit that it's changed somewhat, because we don't need a 300,000 word Tolkien trilogy. We have movies.
Yes.
Reading has a different function, a different place. We do it for a different reason. And, we want to immerse ourselves in some multi-sensory, lush garden of word and imagery. We have different media to do that now. So maybe it is that the book does, in 2018, tell the story in a more truncated and direct fashion and engage you, just because that's what we expect of literature now. Our taste shift.
And people seem to have, they have all these other things they are trying to do, so they don't have as much free time because there's other things to do. The video games, get on the internet and yell at somebody on Twitter or whatever the case may be. There's so many things out there. You can't sit and read a book like I used to when I was a kid. I'd go to the school library and just pick them off one at a time throughout the year, and by the end of the year I was done with the library. Kids don't do that today. There's too many other things out there. So as a writer, if I want people to read me, I guess I've come to the conclusion I got to get it told and get it out. And if it's 60,000 or 50,000 or 70,000, so be it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are and in addition, as an editor, I see a lot of times where a description can come out very long and sort of awkward because it's something that doesn't really need to be described in so much depth. Like if you're going into the description of a room, or for sci-fi or fantasy, if you're doing world building, it's really best to do it as it goes along and as it makes sense. But if you're going to try and put your exact vision out there in one big clump, a lot of times it does come out awkward, and it's something that needs to just be pared down anyway. So, I mean, it is a matter of like, what serves the story best? What serves this world best? How can we see this along with the characters in a way that is not an info dump type of thing? So and that can be advice across any genre, but I especially find that in fantasy and sci-fi, if it's just too much, it can be too much. And then you have people skipping as well over what you've written. And that's the last thing you read.
Yeah, you don't want that.
We are going to now saying that's why audiobooks are becoming more and more popular. We spend more time in traffic than we do in our own homes, which is a great point. Again, you know, just like me, I don't have too much time to read. I'm an editor full time. I read all day, you know, and into most of the night, and then I'm going to listen to an audiobook, you know.
Yeah, the example I come up with, there's an episode of Frasier many years ago where he's reading a book, and the scene is basically the character is telling his first love goodbye. So it's this is all this section of the book is going to say is he's saying goodbye. He starts to read it. He reads about a page of it, and then he starts flipping because the description of this goodbye is continuing going. He goes about 6 pages, and then finally gets to the page where the goodbye has finally been said. So the author just took way too long he said goodbye. You know, it didn't take 6 pages to do that, you know, so that's kind of what I don't think will fly today. You can't get that overly wordy and expect the reader to stay with you without jumping ahead. And I've done that myself too. I confess I've jumped. Because it's like, this is just too much. We're okay, now we're back to the story. Here we go, you know.
Yeah, and I do think dropping descriptions of characters in one big paragraph it depends. Like, I guess it can work sometimes. It really depends on the situation. But I don't know how many of you have read books from like the 1920s, 1930s, anything like that, like noir type books, where they'll be like, you know, here is Gerald. Gerald is blonde. Gerald has blue eyes. You know what I mean? And it's not engaging. It's just sort of it's sort of boring, you know. It's not part of the story. It's not the same. And I do feel like there's a higher expectation from readers today to make everything part of the story. It all has to do with something.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So for the sci-fi writers, and of course fantasy writers, feel free to answer as well, but for the sci-fi writers, with science and technology, including things like AI, moving ahead so fast, do you find it difficult to write sci-fi that's ahead of all that and is still futuristic?
Yes. I bet Jackie and Kelsey are going to say no because they're a part of this world. But yes, I find myself in daily life not completely keeping up with things that are happening around me, and I can imagine a future in which the trends that I see begin to shape and influence my everyday, but I will never fully understand them because they're not intuitive to me. I will participate in them, much like my mother grudgingly uses a cell phone, and not really very well. So that will be, I mean, it's changing for me far too rapidly.
I grew up in school. I always gravitated toward the sciences, and I had a really good science teacher early on who got me really hooked into, you know, you may not be a scientist when you grow up, and I certainly did not make it to that occupation, but I always kept up with it. So when I write science fiction, I like to take what is being considered as, you know, yesterday we thought this was impossible. Today we're thinking, okay, we've got the bits and pieces where we think we can do this a few decades down the line. And then I jump those few decades down the line. And this is what I think it's going to look like when they get there. So that's kind of what I do with it. So, you know, as long as I don't come up with something too crazy, I don't think a science fiction writer is ever going to not be able to kind of take whatever they're working on today and imagine what it's going to be down the line. We may not get it right all the time. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, you know, some of the sci-fi writers didn't quite get the Star Trek stuff right, because you still have buttons and levers in the original Star Trek, and now you've got touchpads and you can just talk to it. So I think we'll always be able to do that. It's just, as long as the imagination is there, we're going to be able to do that.
Well, when's the last time anybody's seen any like science fiction television program or read a book that was something inconceivable in the book? Like I could never imagine that. That's a weird future. Like I think it's all based on what you have to write based on what you already know. So everything's based on science today. And even technology has its limitations because there is a way that the universe and the world works. So it's never going to go beyond anything. So I think those stories, I don't think they're so much based on the actual science. I think it's based on more of the human element. They're all parables. The robots take over. They're all parables of what you should and should not do with certain things. That's all they are. So it's not based on like, oh, he made up this weird technology and that could never happen. No, it's all about the robots took over, but what does that teach us? You know what I mean? I think it's more based on writers approaching all that from that standpoint and not so much creating a new technology that they think would happen in 1,000 years based on what knowledge we know now. It wouldn't be that way. It would be something like a Terminator or something based on what we know now, or cloning or things, black holes, things of that nature. So it's not so much about the science. I think it's just more about, how people relate to that kind of change in that atmosphere. That's what I think is. That's what I think their approach is, which I would think would make it easy to write science fiction just based on that alone. Just our adjustments to the rights and wrongs.
I think you're absolutely right, Jackie. I totally agree that it doesn't matter that it doesn't prove out to be accurate. It's that is it feasible? Does it make sense? Does it resonate with us now? The first Blade Runner film came out in 1982, and there's a fabulous scene of Deckard in a bar using a video payphone and that was mind-boggling in 1982. And I just read recently that there are no payphones on the entire island of Manhattan. So yeah, Ridley Scott got that interpretation of Philip Dick wrong. But the theme of the film, what is life and does AI rise to that level of definition? That's timely and thought-provoking, because ultimately that's about human condition. It doesn't really matter that the individual tech wasn't right.
Right.
Another thing that sci-fi does for writers is it's also another world-building aspect where you take a fringe science that has kind of a long way purpose to it, that it would affect us as a society, and see how it does. You can basically build up a whole new world for that. Just how we would react, how we build new infrastructure and new things around it, the show Altered Carbon. Or basically, the whole idea of identity, physical identity, becomes very fluid. Yeah. So
I wonder, back to the topic of what is the core definition really of either or both sci-fi or fantasy, if that's not really a part of it too. It's that you introduce a new variable, but ultimately the genre is about the human reaction to whatever difference there is in the world. Because these are very, very human stories. They are about what kind of things are we, what kind of creatures are we, how does our perception work, and how do we react hypothetically to a world with all these new variables, whether that be something completely fantastic or something plausibly scientific in the near future. It all is really still an exploration of what we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are great points. So how much of your time would you say, your writing time, has to be dedicated to research? Because even in fantasy, of course, sci-fi has to be, I guess, heavily researched, even if sci-fi is the background of your novel. So there's got to be some research done. Even in fantasy, if your story is going to be based in medieval times, you may need to do some amount of research on the period, but it all depends on what you're trying to achieve. So how much of your writing time do you think that you generally have to spend doing research? Or do you have a certain order you do things, research first, write and then research?
For me, it's I have to plan everything out ahead of time, because I am a real planner when it comes to writing. I have to plan basically bullet points of what is going to happen throughout the whole thing before I write a thing. And research is part of the initial planning. I'll come up with what's going to happen, and I'm like, how is that going to happen? And most of the research I had to do for my first book so far was research about different types of combat, because action sequences are very, very big in my book. And one of the things I did for research was actually go to a gun range and see how that felt. So that was pretty fun.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a good point about the combat, because fantasy is so heavy into like wars and stuff like that, and you really need to be able to create something very realistic, even if it's fantastical.
Yeah.
There's a anthology series called the Planetary Anthology Series that's coming out. It's going to be 11 books, and I wound up writing short stories for 7 of them, and each one had a little different element of science fiction that I had to deal with. Where, you know, for example, one story is the last days of the planet Earth before the sun, as it's dying, kind of expands out, and it will eventually swallow up the Earth. So I had to go and talk to a scientist who works at NASA. She was a very good resource for me. And I was like, okay, now how long does this process take? And if I actually have a human being on the planet Earth, you know, what would they see as it's coming? So we work all that out, and I had to do that before I could even write the story, because I wanted to make sure that it was plausible what I was presenting. You know, I didn't want to come up with something and somebody comes along and say, no, that's not how the sun's going to expand as it's dying. And then in the next story, I'm dealing with a drive engine for a spaceship that is right now, you know, on the theoretical boards, but they don't know how they're going to make it work. And so I'm picking this one engineer's brain going, okay, if you could get it to do this, could I do this with it? He's like, yeah, but we're still trying to figure out how to make it do that. I'm like, I don't care. If you do get it to do that, can I do this? Yes. Okay. That's all I need to know. So I have to do that with each in science fiction. I want to make sure my science is, as Tony mentioned earlier, it may not be in use today, but at least it's plausible. And it has to be plausible enough for the reader to buy in. If I can get them to buy in, I can sell them just about anything. But they've got to buy in that basic premise first, or I'm never going to get them.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so great answers. I have to say, yeah, of course, historical fiction is very different. Like 50% of my time is research, or maybe 75%. I don't know. It's crazy. But we do have a question in the chat from Joe Compton. He is asking, what aspect of your worlds and in the building, in building them, have you not explored that you plan to do in the future?
I'm probably going to explore a lot of different aspects of sailing and living on islands, because there's a part of the world I made up that it's like basically an island nation where it's just a bunch of scattered islands. So, and the characters will eventually go there. So I want to kind of research what that kind of living is like.
Richard, were you going to say something?
No, it's a good question. I'm just trying to think what I haven't gotten myself into recently that I need to get to doing. You know, I don't know. I'm doing a series of books aimed for kids in between the 4th and 7th grades, and it's connected with something my grandson came up with. So I guess that's something I'm gonna have to get into, is seeing the universe through the eyes of someone who's, say, between 9 and 13 again, because it's been a few years since I've done that. So that's probably something I'll be exploring. It's just how the world looks to someone that young. And
my novel ends in an apocalypse. It's a dystopic novel after nuclear catastrophe. And my planned follow-up on that is, with humanity's collective memory, how do we rebuild, and do we repeat the mistakes of the past that led to the ultimate collapse, or do we get it right this time? And I'm not sure which side I come down on that, because I still think we're basically flawed creatures. And I think there might be patterns that repeat themselves, but on the other hand, I'm trying to take a slightly more optimistic view.
Yeah, these are great things to think about. In regards to the thinking from a child's perspective, Richard, I know that can be extremely difficult to figure out how to like write deep POV, for example, from a child's perspective, the words, its vocabulary and everything, you know, exactly what would they really realistically say? What grammar do they actually have down? Stuff like that can easily slide by. It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but it's one I really want to do because, like I said, it's a project with my grandson, and it'll be special. It's just not something I normally do, so it'll be a good challenge.
That's great. So since we were speaking about video games before, do you think that video games have played any part in the evolution of sci-fi and fantasy novels?
Well, I don't know how many gamers we have here. But I would say yes, definitely. I grew up in the 90s, 2000s, so I played a lot of video games. I'm kind of like a hybrid. I played a lot of RPGs, which are very long, narrative-driven games. Okay, but I played them before the technology they didn't have room to put voice actors on the disc and make the voices work, so it was all done in words still. So I did a lot of reading, but it was just I read video games, and that's kind of what pushed me to be a writer, like Final Fantasy 7 and 8. But for me, yeah, it really it kind of shaped me. That's where I get my sci-fi build from. I played a lot of like Final Fantasy 7, 8, Kingdom Hearts, a lot of these games growing up. So for me, it definitely did, and it still continues to do so because games now, I don't know if you guys follow them, they're not just they're not that anymore. A lot of games have professional voice actors. They have scripts written for them by professional writers. You know, Mark Hamill's done video games. So, you know, that's kind of what I want to get into now. I want to do screenplays and stuff for video games. So they still continue to help me, you know, pursue my dreams. So I would say definitely yes.
Well, I think God of War would be an example I would bring up. The whole God of War series. That's
new one?
I have played it, yes.
I'm playing the new one right now. That game is fantastic. Very great narrative. It is.
I have an
a
embarrassing admission to make. I spent 5 years immersed in the world of Warcraft when I was in my mid-40s, and my experience of that interactive role-playing environment was that, you know, for me, Pong was a video game, and now that's something that they show in 80s retro films, right? And so the game world now is something that's entirely different, and the ability to immerse into that world. And I remember sometimes actually forgetting that my avatar was not myself, that in real life I'm not an 8-foot-tall minotaur with a supreme axe that can slay villages with a glance. But that it also opened up the possibility of thought. You know, where do I begin and end? And what possibility is there? And gaming gave me all sorts of ways to start redefining what counts as connectedness and all of that. It certainly broadened my view, definitely. And how much it shapes the content of my work, I don't know, but it opens the possibility space.
Yeah, my first role-playing game was Phantasy Star 2. And we'll see if Jackie, you remember that one?
Yeah,
that's way back in the day. That's before time almost.
Oh, really? Wow. I remember the Phantasy Star series. They haven't done one in a long time. People miss
it. So when you look at that game and then you look at like the God of War series, it is this so much difference now that in a way these, you know, like you were saying, they've got scripts, they've got these stories that you pause right in the middle of playing the game. So they give you this information in the form of kind of a little mini video, but it's almost like walking into a novel instead of just reading one. So yeah, it's definitely, video games have definitely had an impact on science fiction and fantasy, and it's having an impact on how it's written, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if any of you have played the Elder Scrolls series at all. That's one I really liked Morrowind was my favorite one. And so when I first played that, that was the first one like that I had played. Before that, it was all like first-person shooter types of stuff. And this was like a brand new experience for me. And it got me interested in fantasy books because I hadn't been reading fantasy before that. But once I was in this fantastical place where I could, you know, play first person in this open world, I was like, wow, I have to check out fantasy novels now. And I did. And it was, I had an appreciation I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think it can work both ways with the appreciation, you know, of novels and video games. And it did make me interested in someday writing like a fantasy type of thing of my own, because I saw what I would want to include that was a little bit different than I may have experienced if I had never played that video game before. We have a really funny question from Antonio, and I'm going to put it here because it's funny. He says, which garners more FBI watch lists, fantasy or sci-fi research? Does researching nuclear fallout patterns bring more attention from the feds than blood rituals in the 1900s? I really like that because we're always, as writers, joking about, you know, all the things we have to research, like ways to kill people and how long does it take for somebody to die when they're hit on the head and stuff like that.
Yeah, I had a friend who wrote dark horror, and I used to tell him, I'm glad that you write that, actually, because I don't want you carrying it around in your head unexpressed. That's dangerous, and you know, I don't know if I have a federal file. If I do, anything that they think is provocative is just false. We're actually very boring people. We have exciting minds, but you know, anything we can think of, it's not sinister. It's something that's just out there.
We're not doers. We just write about it.
Yeah, I've recently been doing a lot of research for historical fiction on both poisons and drugs, so it's not looking good for me at all. So I really appreciate that question, Antonio.
Yeah, try writing a political thriller and do your research online and realize, ah, crap, I'm going to get a phone call from the FBI if I keep this up, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I have the assassination of a president in my novel, and so, you know, the other thing, I'll say this as a note of caution, I'm sure you've all run across it. You research some really strange things, so you don't necessarily want your spouse or partner to be checking your search history. That's...
Yeah.
That's a good point.
He's okay with it. The worst thing I ever had to look up was like what happens to your body when you get struck by lightning.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. Just not the physical, like what physically happens.
I had to look up for one of my books, and I won't say which one, what happens when you stab someone in the head in different places, so I could pick which place was best. It was like, really didn't want to see any of the pictures or anything I came across.
Yeah, I would say don't Google security protocols to protect the president from assassination. That's probably the wrong screen. Yeah.
Yeah. That's not good. I have one more question for you guys, and that has to do with the cover. So the cover is going to help, of course, show readers what genre they can expect, along with the title, but the cover, I would say, even more so, probably. So what do you think is most important for a fantasy or sci-fi novel to have on the cover? And I know that that is subjective depending on your storyline, of course, but if you're trying to show your genre, for example, is there anything that you would advise other people it would be best if you could, you know, use these colors or this kind of a graphic or anything?
It's best to probably just try your best to get the overall tone of your novel in a picture. Like if you doing like a very dark fantasy, you really want to communicate that. So people looking for like a bright, sunny fantasy won't pick this up and go, "Oh, this sounds like fun."
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing a lot of covers from different authors are really starting to look pretty much the same to me. So I'm pretty much drawn to anything that looks different. That's why I kind of chose the the covers of my book. I didn't want it to look, like shirtless, massive guy or sexy lady. And like, I'm so tired of those covers, especially in like the romance genre. It's driving me nuts. When I seen your book, Christie, I was immediately drawn to it because your covers aren't like anything I've seen. I was like, what's that about? And then I was actually like, wow, what is she writing? Because what you're writing, no one else is writing, which I think is awesome, by the way. That Victorian kind of like psychological horror thing. I haven't read it yet. It just seems cool. Yeah, so just covers that don't look like anything else, that kind of stand on their own. Just trying to be very, unique with the cover, Like my covers, I went more simple. Like I think the coolest, I think more like movie posters when I think of book covers. Like if you remember Ridley Scott's Alien, it just has the egg with the little light coming out of it. I thought that was the scariest thing in my life. So like it's just something simple like that is what I went for, and I kind of think it works out.
Jackie, you mentioned them looking alike. Have you've seen the cover art cliches? It's a man in silhouette from behind looking out across some futurescape. 9 out of 10 covers fit into some stereotype in it. And I know that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I can judge a book by its cover. I can say, boy howdy, that's an ugly book. It is important. I mean, why don't we break up the just these rote patterns of things? It's as though there's a cover mill out there that's cranking out the same thing over and over.
Right.
Yeah, I think the cover is your first opportunity to get the reader's attention. And it's got, you try, the covers that drive me crazy is you read the book and you go back to the cover and you go, that had nothing to do with the book. What was this? You just threw stuff together. So yeah, it's an important part because that's your first impression. And sometimes you only get that one. So you want something that's going to be eye-catching. And I like your point, Jackie, about especially in that one particular genre where it's always, the guy with the shirt off or, the busty woman, it's like, oh my God, really? Come on, do something different. Let's get something original and maybe I might read that book.
Yeah, I agree. And I've heard, and thank you so much for what you said, Jackie, by the way, that meant a lot to me. I have heard both sides of it. I've heard people say, like for romance, for example, well, I'd like to see a lot more different things. I'd like to see something unique. And then on the other side, I heard people say, oh, but that shows them exactly what they're getting before they get into it. And I do have to sort of say, when I look at a cover, I do also, like all of you are saying, I look for something different. But I do expect that the cover is going to cover something. It's going to make sense to something in the book. And when it doesn't, that can be a problem. Now, I know traditional publishers do not necessarily feel that way. And we have had a couple of interesting, I don't know what to call it nicely, issues in the book community where there have been covers that didn't really represent. There was one author that made fun of his own cover and the artist took major offense. There was another with Brandon Sanderson where the cover didn't quite look like what people thought it should look like with the type of magic it was or something like that. And that was a thing. But, even Brandon Sanderson himself says while he teaches, and you can find him on YouTube teaching, it's really the traditional publisher is looking to just draw people in, and it doesn't always have to be accurate. To me, that drives me crazy and I hate it, but they do it anyway, and it does draw people in. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Well, with the exception of Escaping Infinity, I've done all my book covers. So if I ever get mad at my book cover artist, it gets interesting when I start yelling at myself. But it's important to me to have a cover that does have something to do with the book, that is interesting looking, that catches the eye. And I have seen some covers, by people who I would like to probably read, but as soon as I see the cover, it's like, oh my God, that is so awful. I'm not touching that. And it's just, I don't know if I'm in the majority or the minority in that part, but to me, that cover, if it's that hideously bad, I'm thinking, what's below there might be even worse, and I just don't want to. I don't want to waste my time on it. I've got other things I want to read. So yeah, it's big to have that cover rate.
But you know what really interests me about this whole subject is that the printing press is 700 years old now. The advent of the full color, the printed artistic cover is a little less than a century old, and for it to be very popular at all, you're talking about the 1950s. I mean, for the longest time, a book was plain clad in a binding with its title on the front, if at all. Sometimes you had to open. And those things got read. So, you know, this touches on Jackie's point earlier that, you know, the readership has changed. They need something from me that I don't know that I'm really the best to do. And that's why, and I've made my own covers too, Richard, and I consider myself a fool for doing it, because I probably need somebody who gets what works. You know, what is the, you know, how does an image work psychologically to grab the reader? If they pick it up, they open a page, they read the first paragraph, they're going to buy the book.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what you want to do. And obviously the cover then serves a purpose.
Yeah.
Well, when I was getting my cover made for Beyond the Code, the artist gave me a couple examples of different things that they were doing. And one was a bit more of like, kind of looks like more of a movie trailer kind of movie trailer or poster kind of thing. And the other one was a little different, and he kind of suggested like this one's a little different, so that might pull in more people, but it gave the wrong tone of the book. It didn't really give the feel that I really wanted. And the movie poster one did, and it was a little bit like on the nose of what was happening, but it communicated more what the book was about. And so I went with that one.
You know, on the subject of book covers, you know, with the paperback books that most of us are publishing in, you know, the book cover we worry about. As an odd thing that I do with the hardcovers that have the dust jackets, Tony, you were mentioning they have it in the plain binding. I like those. So when I get a book, a hardcover book, that dust jacket, in the trash it goes, and it's on my shelf. And if you look behind me, there you go. All those have the dust jackets are long gone. So I apologize to the cover creators because I know you put a lot of work into it, but when it comes to my hardcover books, I want that binding. I want to see that binding, and the other stuff just doesn't do it for me. It might get me to buy your book, but after that, the jacket's gone.
That's fair.
All right. Well, we are at 10 o'clock now. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Stay tuned. Everybody is going to tell you where you can find them. And after that, we're going to have a big announcement about the Writer's Edge. I think you guys are going to love what we have to say. So let's get started. First of all, thank you to our panelists so much. This was a great discussion, and we brought up a lot of great points. And I, as always, learned something from you guys. So let's start with Tony. Tell us where we can find you.
Tony-Phillips.com. I'm on YouTube at tphillipssd, which is also my Twitter handle. And you can find the Fires of Orc on Amazon or any other major bookseller.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Great. And on to Kelsey, and then we'll get back to our mysterious guest who's been sitting with us, hanging out.
You can find pretty soon the website is still being made, but pretty soon you'll be able to find all the news and stuff about me at kelseybarthel.ca, or you can look up the Beyond the Code's Facebook page on Facebook, and you can buy the Beyond the Code on Amazon, Indigo, Barnes & Noble, and at inkshares.com.
Great, thanks. And we have Jackie.
Hi, you can find some of my work at my website, JackieCarrbooks.com. That's book with an S. And like I said, my new release should be out either hopefully tonight or tomorrow morning. So look forward to that, MARTYR Substance. I'm also on Facebook. Just type in my name, Jackie Carr, and look for this face, and we'll go from there. If you guys know Christie, we're friends. You can find me through a couple of links of hers too. So thanks for having me, guys.
Hey, good luck on the new book launch.
Yeah, good luck.
Yay. Good luck.
And next, Richard.
You can find me at sci-fi-scribe.com. That's all one word because my last name is hideously long and terrible to try to spell. You can find my books, Escaping Infinity and Maelstrom, on Amazon, and in September when The Gods Fell will be out. And that's the new sci-fi fantasy coming up. But go to the website. That will tell you everything you need to know about all the books I've written and what else I'm up to.
Great, thank you. And you guys know me, I am Christie Stratos. You can find me, of course, here on The Writer's Edge. You can find us on the website, thewritersedgeshow.com. On Facebook, we have a group. And like I said, here on Twitter, or here on YouTube, this is not Twitter, oh my God. As for me, myself, as an author, you can find me at christiestratos.com. I am also on Instagram. I do haikus there and positivity. Facebook, where I do Victorian stuff. Twitter, where I do whatever. And on YouTube, I also do a live stream every Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And now it is time for our announcement, and you can find out who our guest is that has been sitting with us for a little while. Mickey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mickey Mickelson, publicist with Creative Edge. I've never been part of a captive audience before with this. 3 of my clients, along with Jackie, so thanks for being part of that. And just a great discussion, and all of you guys were, and lady, were just wonderful. So, yeah.
We have some exciting stuff coming up on The Writer's Edge. Mickey and I are actually going to be teaming up going forward. He's going to be my co-host for The Writer's Edge, which is going to be a huge help to me, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And in addition to that, we're also going to have a bit of a new format. We're going to keep these live streams that have panels. These are now going to be round tables that happen once a month, and they will still be about the same length, 45 minutes to an hour. But we also will have a new format where we're going to add one more show. So once per month, we will also have an additional show that's going to be 15 minutes to half an hour, and it's going to be with one person. So we're going to be one-on-one, not necessarily a straight up interview, but discussing something with them that they can help other writers with. And so Mickey and I are really excited about that.
I am ecstatic for this. I think it's going to be amazing. I can't imagine having a better co-host than Christie. And do you want to tell the audience about the first guest we're having, Christie, or do you want to hold that off?
Yeah, no. The next one we're going to have is going to be June 23rd at 9 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to be with New York Times bestselling author Tosca Lee. And we're going to be talking about her upcoming novel-turned-movie, which is super exciting. We're going to talk about how she did it. We're going to talk about her process, turning a novel into a movie, how the whole thing happened. And you guys can tune in. It will be a live stream as always. And that way you can also ask her questions if you have any.
Yeah, it's not been turned yet, but they're pitching right now. So we're hopeful that it's going to happen, but we'll let Tosca talk about that because I know she's really excited to bring up that information. So yeah, it'll be good.
Yeah,
so exciting. So exciting.
It is so exciting. Yeah, and it is currently Tosca's novel pitch is currently in the news. So it's definitely out there. People know about it, and there are a couple of places that might be interested. So we'll be talking to her next month, and we will also announce another roundtable another time. But for now, just get excited about Tosca.
Yes, it'll be amazing.
As always, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to the panelists who did a fantastic job. It was awesome having you and hearing all of your answers and this great discussion. And thank you to our audience members who asked some great questions as well. And we will see you in June. Bye, everyone.
Bye now.